European Union leaders are heading into a high-stakes summit for Ukraine later today. They need to decide unanimously whether to open accession talks with Ukraine and on further financial aid for Kyiv, worth up to 50 billion euros. But one EU country, Hungary, is blocking both attempts.
This is where European Union leaders face a tangle of conflicting interests over aid to Ukraine. They know Hungary wants to veto a plan to deliver a 50 billion euro four-year aid package. And unanimity rules mean that it could. This week in Washington, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky already appealed to the Americans.
It's not about financing. It's about the morality. The biggest problem, when you don't support Ukraine, that people on the front line, families which are waiting for their heroes at home, that they think that the United States doesn't support Ukraine and that Ukraine is alone.
But he failed to persuade them to give his country additional funding. President Joe Biden wants to give Ukraine the money, but is blocked by Republican parliamentarians. Zelensky's hopes now rest with the EU. But here, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is the barrier. He has a pro-Russian stance and doesn't believe Ukraine can win the war. Orban also says he'll prevent the EU opening the process for Ukraine to join.
I have proposed, and I am proposing, that negotiations on Ukraine's membership of the European Union should not begin. We cannot even get it to start, because Hungary would not agree to it. So let's not put it on the agenda.
But on the agenda, it is. The question is, what's Orban's price? The EU has frozen around 30 billion euros of funds due for Hungary, over concerns about Orban's attacks on the judiciary and repression of NGOs. The EU is ready to send around a third, 10 billion euros. But Orban may not drop his veto on Ukraine unless he gets all of it. Some EU leaders believe they'll have a shot at convincing him once they're all in the same room.
And I think it's often better to talk face-to-face than to talk in the press, through open letters and so on.
Failure to secure an agreement on the funding at this EU summit would mean financial uncertainty for Ukraine through 2024.
And for more on all of this, I'm joined now by DW correspondent Rosie Burchard. She joins us from Brussels, where all of this is happening today. Rosie, a tough task there to bring Hungary on board in terms of sending more money to Ukraine. Why?
Well, the optics of this are quite something, because just as leaders began descending on Brussels, the European Commission indeed said it was unfreezing some of those blocked funds for Hungary. And that certainly prompted accusations, at least, that that was basically a bribe to try and get Viktor Orban on board, that it was quite simply a quid pro quo there. Now, I have to say that EU officials deny that entirely. They say that, in fact, Hungary has done some judicial reforms, and therefore this was just the next step procedurally. That now having happened, the money now in question at this summit in this building is that 50 billion euros so crucial for Ukraine. And EU leaders are trying to get agreement on that. 26 of them are happy to green-light it, but there too Hungary is blocking. And they think that the other leaders say that getting this funding for Ukraine will not only send a strong signal to Kyiv that the EU is by its side, but send a signal to Moscow that the EU is there to support Ukraine for the long term, and send a signal to Washington, where, of course, American lawmakers are also in their own dispute over funding for Ukraine. Now, the important thing to note is that for this 50 billion euros in funding, there is at least an unofficial plan B under which the 26 other members of the European Union could simply come together and greenlight and send those funds to Ukraine. But diplomats here know that at least the optics of doing it that way as a divided union would be far from ideal.
There is one more important topic there on the agenda, the start of EU membership talks with Kyiv. And again, Hungary is in opposition, calling this an unprepared and untimely plan. What does Viktor Orban mean by that?
Well, I think there is no disputing the fact that Ukraine joining the European Union now would indeed be a big upset for the Union as it currently stands. For example, it would completely change the way that the European Union distributes funding for farmers. Just for example, Ukraine is a very large country, but the rest of the EU leaders think that nonetheless it's a political moment to send a signal to Ukraine, and that in the meantime the EU could work on its own reforms, rewriting its own rule book in order to be able to absorb Ukraine in the longer term. And we know this is really important, not just for lawmakers in Kyiv, not just for officials, but also for people in Ukraine and for soldiers on the front line. That's what President Zelensky often says, is that this is a big motivator, that idea, that dream of one day having a permanent seat at this table here in Brussels. Now, Orban is still blocking that as far as we know, and what diplomats have told me is that it will really be all come down to what happens in the room here in Brussels. And buckle up for a bumper summit, because it could be that we're really here for days reporting on this, because what's important to know here, I mentioned that plan B for the funding. Well, there is no plan B for membership talks, because that simply has to be done unanimously. So all EU members would have to green light that decision to open accession talks with Ukraine, and we simply don't know where this is going to land yet. And diplomats that I spoke to heading into these talks said they simply don't know what Orban's end game is here.
A bumpy road ahead, that's for sure. Great to have you there helping us make sense of it all. That was DW correspondent Rosie Burchard. Thank you so much.